Greetings again, and welcome to the StraighterLine webinar, Re-engage, Re-enroll, Recover, how state systems of higher education can support comebackers. I'm John Lane, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Equity Initiatives at Sheeo, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and I'm pleased to serve as moderator for today's discussion. On behalf of our panelists and attendees, I want to thank StraighterLine for hosting our webinar. Stop-outs, reconnectors, and comebackers describe the many enrollees, institutions, policymakers, and other key stakeholders support who were interrupted mid-progression from credential attainment. The circumstances impacting student persistence have been many, and pre-pandemic numbers were high. All of us may recall the 2019 National Student Clearinghouse report of 36 million Americans with some college, but no degree and no longer enrolled. Of course, COVID has exacerbated conditions. Enrollment has plummeted. Many students have faced financial difficulties, and potential students are increasingly cost and risk conscious and seek more accessibility. As a result, the future of higher education's sustainability and value rests on removing financial, academic, and personal barriers to re-enrollment. There is a path forward, and here today is our panel of 4 nationally recognized practitioners and policy leaders to talk with us about ways we can re-engage learners who have stopped out of higher education. Amanda Winters is the Program Director for Postsecondary Education at the National Governors Association. Dr. Jim Henderson serves as President of the University of Louisiana System. Andrew Kelly serves as the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Policy at the University of North Carolina System. And Burke Smith is the founder and CEO of StraighterLine. Thank you for being here. Our format will include dialogue with panelists, followed by questions from you, our audience. Let's begin with our first question for Amanda. Can you give us an overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic shifted states' focus on stop-outs?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, John. I'm excited to be here today talking about this important topic. I'm gonna speak from a 30,000-foot level. So excited to have some institutional leaders on the line with us who can really speak to the nuts and bolts of the individual student interaction and experiences. But from where I sit at the National Governors Association, we have been working with states on issues surrounding adult students and some college and no degree. And we certainly saw some trends in approaches over the time of COVID around their sort of consideration of outreach. Now, we sit at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. There were no best practices for the pandemic. It wasn't like I could go to a shelf and say, here's what other states have tried during a similar crisis. Nope. So everybody just had to be like, this is what we feel like is working or is something that should be scaled or considered. So just a handful of those things, certainly innovative partnerships, which is, I think, is something we'll bring up today. Is really thinking about who else is out there that can help institutions or students connect and engage to post-secondary pathways or reskilling pathways if they've seen disruption within their industry sector. So sort of those things going hand in hand, like who's out there who can help us. Certainly saw a lot of states working with credentialing bodies like CompTIA, which is looking at the technical certifications. Google was a partner for a lot of states and thinking about how can we quickly get some skill development and certifications into the hands of learners. So I think innovative partnerships was really sort of a who out there can help us. Also some focused funding. The example I'll throw out is one that I'm sure everybody's familiar with is Governor Whitmer's Future for Frontliners. And thinking about, how can we focus in on some of these populations who need to connect to post-secondary pathways, and how can some of the COVID relief funds help us do that? And then I think supports across systems, because those comebackers or those adult students who are disconnected were not only needing to access career pathways and learning opportunities, they needed childcare supports, they needed food supports, they needed transportation supports, housing supports. So a lot of things sort of coalescing together. So I think the thinking across systems, the looking for all the partners in the space, and then looking to see how they can strategically utilize some of the funding that was coming from the federal government for relief, thinking about ways in which they could direct that to programs that were directly serving those adult students who had been disconnected, maybe before the pandemic or because of the pandemic.
That's really informative, and it segues so well into a follow-up question. From what you've seen across the country, how has governors' thinking about higher education and re-enrollment changed during the pandemic? And you're welcome to provide an example if one comes to mind.
I would say building along some of the investments that have already been made across states that were in progress when the pandemic hit. I do think some of the changing around these issues, I think it's highlighted the regionality of some of these issues and the ways in which local partners need to be engaged in the solutions. So I've seen a lot more of a shift in that direction rather than sort of, certainly the state approach to investing in and incentivizing regionality and regional approaches to serving students. I've seen that as being sort of a shift that is solidified during the COVID-19 pandemic. I will highlight one of the states that's actually on the call is Louisiana. Is certainly thinking about regionality when it comes to connecting students to supports. We've been working with Kim Hunter-Reid's office in thinking about a project focused on the Acadiana region of Louisiana and some work that was ongoing prior to the pandemic. And that work has only accelerated in Louisiana. It's been very exciting to see the connections being made there. And I know Governor Edwards is committed to that type of outreach to those regions within the state that need that support. And so I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really emphasized that for other states as well. Sort of states need to be thinking about the folks on the ground and where they find their networks and connections and where support should come from to help them make that connection to work and to educational opportunities.
That's great to hear. Well, let me transition then to Jim and Andrew. I'll ask the next question. Why is re-enrolling stop-outs in states important to you, to your university systems, and to your state?
Well, if it's okay, Andrew, I'll start with that. We've been talking for we've been in with Zoom for over a year and a half now, and some of us still can't figure out how to unmute before we start talking. So
doing great, Jeff.
Yeah. But Louisiana, we've been talking a lot about the challenges presented by the future of work, right? How advancing technology, the ubiquity of automation and emergence of artificial intelligence, how it's fundamentally changing the nature of work and demanding a much more educated workforce, not just a trained workforce, but a workforce of learners that can continue to adapt. Well, in Louisiana, historically, if you can't look out my windows, but out the window behind me is the Mississippi River. And the window to my left is a large ExxonMobil refinery. They've been bastions of the Louisiana economy since our very beginning. And historically, if you've had a strong work ethic and you've been able to immerse yourself in those aspects of the economy, you've been successful. But the nature of work, even in those two bastions of our economy, has changed forever. We must prepare students, or we must prepare learners who can think critically, who can solve problems, who can communicate effectively, who are culturally competent, who can work as part of a team. These are the skill sets that have historically been associated with a college degree. In Louisiana, if we focused only on the traditional market, the traditional students emerging from high schools, we would never be able to catch up with the demands. But we have 653,000 adults in Louisiana that have some college and no degree. And that's why University of Louisiana System, with our 9 distinct institutions, launched a systemic initiative called Compete Louisiana. It is designed specifically to meet the needs of those learners. We brought in a partner, an incredible partner like StraighterLine, to help us deliver on that work. And we think it's going to be the game changer, not only for Louisiana, but for the Gulf South.
That's fantastic. And Andrew, as you begin to respond, I'm going to invite our attendees with the great information you're receiving from President Henderson, from Amanda, from all of our panelists. As questions come to mind, please send them to us in the chat room, and we'll do our best during our Q&A session toward the end to get to your questions. So thank you. And Andrew, thanks, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, John. And thanks everybody for the invitation to appear here. Similar to the comments from Dr. Henderson, here in North Carolina, we have a somewhat recent post-secondary attainment goal. We were a little bit late to the post-secondary attainment goal game, those being the statewide goals for a certain percentage or certain number of state residents to have completed a college degree or credential. So we finished that work as a joint project of the community college system, the UNC system, the independent colleges, and a whole bunch of stakeholders that resulted in the My Future NC Commission, and now the nonprofit myfuturenc.org. And we set a goal for the state of 2 million North Carolinians by 2030 with some post-secondary credential or degree. So we're a little different. We set a number goal rather than a percentage goal. But as a result of that, no surprise, we've done a lot of analytics on what it's going to take to actually get to that goal. And it's very difficult to get there without a focus on the students who we call partway home students. I like halfbackers or comebackers, sorry, is obviously another way. We've tended to call them partway home, meaning they're partway toward the end of their journey. So we have focused in on that as part of our work. We were focused on it prior to the attainment goal, but that's helped to motivate a broader conversation. Similar to Louisiana, right? We know that there are between 900,000 and 1 million North Carolinians with some college, no degree. It kind of depends on how you count it, whether some folks have certificates or certifications, and those are harder to capture, but we know it's somewhere between 900,000 and 1 million. And when we look at those who have stopped out of our institutions, we know a bunch of information about those. So we have some data. We have sort of a data set that gets updated twice a year about the students that have stopped out for more than a semester or so. And we know from those data that since 2003, among students with a GPA of greater than 2.0, there's 98,000 stop out students, partway home students that have stopped out since 2003. 53,000 of those have 60 or more credits. So you've got just a large number of students that were more than halfway toward their diploma, who are out there and sort of, I would say, ripe for re-engagement. What we also know, though, is that that's really hard work. Back in 2016, the legislature appropriated a one-time non-recurring sum of money for the system to better understand the partway home population, better understand what it takes to bring them back and re-enroll them. We learned a lot from that project. One of the most important things we learned was that stop-outs tend to not be dropping out in general because they have low academic performance. A lot of the stop-outs tend to have pretty good academic performance in general. They're stopping out often for other reasons. That was a great lesson to learn. I'll just give you a couple quick notes on some current efforts that we have underway. So we have been engaged in as part of the Adult Promise project through Sheeo, as part of work on a number of fronts in collaboration with the community colleges here, especially. But we've built a website that's designed to help adult students reconnect both to the community college system, but also to the UNC system and independent colleges. We're thinking now about expanding and ramping up a re-engagement campaign that we've been working on with Inside Track as a partner in the state. And then the last thing I'll cite just quickly is we received some funding from the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund with a focus on completion. And one of the key groups that they'd like us to work with with that allocation of money are partway home students. And so we're considering different ways to fund our institutions, likely on a competitive basis, to go out, re-engage, but not just re-engage, support those students when they come back. and provide them with some sort of on-ramp to up to the finish line. And I think that's where, if I had to kind of pinpoint where I think higher ed is, has the most work to do, I think it's on the supply side of what we do, not necessarily just ginning up demand. I think we've learned a lot about how to help, how to contact people, help bring them back. We've got to figure out also how to fix the supply side so that adults can be successful once they arrive.
That's great perspective, and we really need to talk about that some more. But with strategies such as what you have in North Carolina, Burke, I'll ask the next question to you. And with the partnership with the University of Louisiana System, what about this approach can best help students get back on track to complete a credential of value?
Yeah, thanks. So I could not have asked for a better segue than what Andrew said. It wasn't deliberate, I promise. The first, as Andrew said, adult learners stop out for a reason, and it's usually not academic. It's something else, and it's life. It's how the courses are delivered to them that doesn't fit with their life. All health, family, work, whatever it is, but it's usually not because they can't do the math or the writing. The second is, again, what Andrew said on the supply side is how do you construct pathway programs or entry points that make it conducive for adult learners to return. And that's what we've done with University of Louisiana System and Compete Louisiana. And so for adult learners, they stopped out for a reason. Trying to re-engage them by just exhorting them to come back and do the same thing they failed out the first time is not a great strategy. So a better way to think of it is, how do you de-risk that re-entry? How do you make it so it's not hard for them to come back in? And what we've done with the University of Louisiana System, the Compete Louisiana program, is built, we call it Academy, but it could be called Bridge or it could be called Pathway, it doesn't really matter. But it's a pathway program of 2 to 6 courses that looks very different than what a traditional college would offer. They're self-paced, you pay on a subscription basis, usually at a much lower price than you would if you just sort of enrolled directly. And if you succeed with those courses, they transfer and count for credit. And if you don't succeed, well, you haven't spent much. And one of the statistics that I like to use for StraighterLine in general is any given day, roughly 25% of our enrollments are re-enrollments. So these are students that took a couple courses with StraighterLine, stopped, dealt with work, life, family, whatever it is, came back and took a couple more courses, or maybe paused midway, dealt with work, life, family, and came back. And that's totally fine. And in fact, that's the way non-traditional students in particular learn. And we can do that because we charge on a subscription basis rather than a flat fee, once a semester. But if that student had paused in a traditional college environment, that would be a dropout. They would have forfeited all their tuition up front. They'd put Title IV at risk. They'd have a black mark on their transcript, and whatever psychological damages inflicted by failing out, they would have then incurred that as well. So what we don't realize is that re-enrollment is a high-risk decision, especially for those who failed the first time, and doing things to de-risk that entry point makes a big difference. And we have really good statistics, and it's sort of not surprising, but if a student proves they're successful with some of these low risk, low price courses, they're then more likely to be successful than their peers when they enroll. And that aligns with things we've seen in PLA, with transfer students. So not surprisingly, prove success in a small, sort of low risk, low cost environment, and then you're likely to have more success in a higher cost, higher risk environment. But we haven't built those pathways. But we are doing that with the University of Louisiana System.
Great points, and highlighting the risks to students for re-enrollment, that's very relevant. And I'm sure that there's so much more they could say about it. We talked about the great work going on in University of North Carolina System, University of Louisiana, leading the way system there. Are there other institutions, Burke, that are innovating in these kinds of ways to help stop out, to re-enroll and complete their higher education path? And I'm asking Burke in particular if you know of some other examples or any of us.
Yeah, so I think in general, what we've seen over the last decade, and StraighterLine has been a pioneer in this. We've been doing this since 2008. But the growth of the non-college post-secondary sector has been enormous. And in many ways, what we saw in this last recession rather, was extremely counterintuitive. One would expect enrollments to grow during a recession, as they have over the past 2 recessions, and they did not this time. Now, there may be some other reasons for that, but it's sort of on its face, that's really kind of shocking. And I think what it says is that students, it's not that they don't want to learn or don't want to improve their careers, it's that they're finding other sources or other avenues to do so. And so colleges need to figure out ways to bring in and partner with these additional business models if they're going to serve the students that are out there. And these are particularly non-traditional students. I think the ones that are least affected are that 18 to 22-year-old kind of residential student. We're not, I think this panel in particular, but StraighterLine also is not so interested in those. But but that other group has very different learning needs, and now they have a lot more options that work better for their lifestyle. And if colleges can't accommodate those options and those price points, the students are going to find other sources of ways to get what they need.
Agreed. Andrew, you've touched on this already, but perhaps to bring it out a little bit more, has the pandemic changed your thinking around how to best support learners?
I think absolutely. And I think in many respects, it really forced us to build and flex a muscle that maybe we hadn't had as much before, as a system that is traditionally reliant on 18 to 24-year-olds, right? We're only, it's worth pointing out that at the undergraduate level, only 10% of our FTEs over the age of 25 in the UNC system, right? And that's 16 public four-year universities. And most of that 10% is concentrated at a handful of institutions, right? That serve more, in particular, Fayetteville State, which has a relationship with Fort Bragg and serves a lot of military and veterans. And then also UNC Charlotte, which is in an urban center. So what I think the pandemic did, and this was in part with help from our legislature, we received some funding to do a number of things to enhance digital learning, but not just digital learning in terms of the content side and the actual sort of courses that are offered, but also what we call virtual student supports. So coaching, heavy investment in coaching to help students through the summer, because we were fully remote for the summer, and then also through the fall, because a good number of our courses were still being offered in a remote fashion in the fall, as well as tutoring. So virtual tutoring, expansion of that opportunity. And so we made some grants to our institutions through federal relief that was appropriated by the General Assembly to implement augmented virtual student supports, which I think really was a good opportunity for us to learn about what it takes to support students that are learning online, and in some cases in a mix of online and in person. But I think from there, we've now got some really good data and evidence on the impact that such supports can have on students. And I think there's a lot of interest in maintaining some of those even post-pandemic, as we return to quote unquote normal, to continue to support students in the years to come. So I completely agree. I think the support side, though, just to reiterate, I think has been one of the best learning experiences for us.
The past 15 months have forced a significant amount of innovation. You certainly described some, as the entire panel has. Are there practices that higher education should keep? Are there other practices higher education should take a hard look at and perhaps make sure it's a drop?
I will jump in with just some overview things that states are really examining right now. I think one of the barriers being existing student debt for folks who have some college and no degree. I like the close to home. I'm liking it.
Partway home.
Partway home. That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that framing up. It's a positive spin on that. I like it. But I think states are thinking about those barriers of the existing student debt as an issue and how that might be a financial barrier. But also I think institutions are thinking about institutional debt and how that might be barriers for students. Quite a few institutions or systems trying to be flexible and innovative, trying to utilize some funds to provide some opportunities to relief for some of those small debts that keep students from re-enrolling or from transferring. So certainly I think that's a really positive development in just the serving adult learners and space that I'm excited to see advance from the state and from the institutional level. Also, I think, as has been mentioned by some of the leaders here on the webinar, it's really thinking about the humans who are being served and putting them at sort of the center of the development of innovation or the ways in which supports are being offered. So who are these students? What are they bringing to the table? What sort of supports would they need? And the connection and investment in advising across several of our systems, basic supports systems, workforce systems, and education systems. I think advisors being key to re-engaging students in career and education pathways so that they can fully understand their options, so that they can make informed choices, so they can understand the funding that might be available to them. It's a complex world that just putting some information out on a website, a static website, is not necessarily going to help students have everything that they need to respond to their questions. So I think the move to invest in advising and then also to think about, who's being served by these programs and how best to design. I've seen those as really positive developments over the past year of sort of the way in which some of the relief funds are being utilized and students are being served.
That's a great point. I want to follow up specifically on the re-engagement with learners. So my next question for Jim, what are some innovative things that your institutions have done during the pandemic, specifically to keep learners engaged or to re-enroll former students?
Well, so if you're thinking specifically about the pandemic, enough can't be said, and you could say this across the country, about the Herculean task that came before faculty and what faculty were able to do to shift on a dime, especially traditional faculty, right, to implement new modalities of learning, some that they've never practiced before, to re-engage students at a massive level. It was a tremendous undertaking, and I can't say enough about that. But in Louisiana, it was just not the pandemic. We also got hit by 5 named tropical storms last year. Hurricane Laura hit in the southwest corner of Louisiana 6 weeks later, 15 miles east. Hurricane Delta came, 2 of the most powerful storms that ever hit Louisiana. They cut a swath across our state that basically followed the map of University of Louisiana System institutions. So you add that, the operational challenges, of course, but the challenges to students and learners were unprecedented. And so you had to take a new focus, one that probably we should have been doing all along, but a learner-centric focus to everything that you do, whether it was student services, whether it was advising, whether it was the delivery of instruction, because we had to meet people in different levels of disruption to engage them. We were able to bring, and this is one of the powers of a system, bring a notion of systemness, if you would, to the table, where institutions were able to step in for each other, maybe where there wasn't capacity to do certain things, whether it was housing, whether it was mental health counseling or academic counseling. We're able to bring the system to bear to help deliver that. But it also meant that those adult learners that we were trying to serve were put under additional stresses, right? Adult learners have so many life and family obligations, work obligations, and then you throw in a pandemic and you throw in natural disasters. You cannot articulate the scale of that disruption. But it meant the model that we had put in place with Compete Louisiana, that has coaches, that have concierge that are assigned to a learner, that is the single point of contact to the learner. They became those mental health counselors. They became those academic advisors. They became that friend just to cry on the shoulder when things just became overwhelming. And at the same time, we were able to keep these learners engaged, keep them on that path to completion that's going to make them competitive, whatever the new economy brings to us. We don't want to go through a year like 2020 again.
Right.
But one of the lessons learned is that we can go through that year. We don't just survive, we can actually thrive, we can be very successful, and we can keep people on track to the quality of life that is afforded to them only through higher education, only by becoming adaptable learners for the future.
That's great. That's great.
Hey,
Andrew,
John-
did you want to follow up, please?
Yeah, John, just a quick word, I think, but linking together two things, one thing that Amanda said and that one thing that Burke said, I think, the notion of kind of de-risking a return, I think is a really interesting concept. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate and tout in some respects the move to use some of the federal relief dollars to forgive some of the institutional debts and outstanding balances that students have. I mean, it seems to me like a straightforward intuition that if you try to re-recruit somebody in and you say, and by the way, before you're even able to re-enroll, here's your balance that you owe us before you're even able to re-enroll in courses, that's going to be a deal breaker for many.
Right.
And so I do think that was and just a shout out to one of our institutions, Elizabeth City State University up in the northeastern corner of the state. One of our HBCUs has, and others in the system have done this as well, but I want to particularly shout out ECSU for their work to wipe out those outstanding balances, not only for current students who are already enrolled, which should reduce their, obviously their out-of-pocket costs and their student debt, but also wiping the balances for those who have stopped out, so they have just to remove that additional barrier to coming back. I think that's a really interesting. Now, granted, it's going to be it's a temporary one-time flow of federal money. So, but I do think, again, producing some data that gives us a sense of the impact of that kind of invitation, if you will be helpful.
That's a great point. Jim, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, just to follow up on what Andrew's talking about, because he's talking about a real world challenge for these folks, and how many times we erect administrative barriers, right, that prevent learners from returning to us, that actually are anathema to what our mission is. So we did a systemic approach. It seems very small, but just to free the transcript. Thanks. We're not holding a transcript hostage because someone didn't pay a parking ticket or overdue library book. Something even that small can be an insurmountable barrier for learners, especially during times of disruption. And taking that learner-centric focus and saying, how do we remove barriers instead of how we erect them, can be the game changer.
I think one of the great advantages in that context of both what you're doing in Louisiana and in North Carolina, Jim, you captured it in the phrase, leveraging the advantages of being a state system. I think that's just a unique place. I think there's some strategic advantage there. And I think the thoughts behind that and the strategizing of leveraging that just deserves continued audience. I think there's a lot of wisdom, I'm sure, lessons learned and advice to provide. Kudos to North Carolina, to Louisiana, and everywhere else where the needs are being met and addressed, by all means. So let's follow up, Jim and Andrew. Next question I want to ask you particularly is about advice you would give. What advice would you both give to people who work in similar positions to you in university systems in other states and want to do more to re-engage their stopouts?
Well, one thing that I'll suggest, and I've used that term learner-centric, we've talked about risk. Bert talked about risk a great deal, and it's academic risk, it's financial risk. And Andrew articulated the financial challenges. There's one more component. The most precious resource that most adults and stopouts have is time. They have precious little time to waste with administrivia. And in higher education, one thing we have perfected over 2 centuries is how to erect administrivia-related barriers to learners coming back. We have been the best at denying entry into our institutions. So taking that learner-centric lens, that frame, if you will, and evaluating every process, every step in the process, and say, how does this add value? How does this help us fulfill the mission of bringing learners back to our institutions and preparing them for life and career success? And if it doesn't add value, which a surprising and astonishingly large number of them do not add value, they're just comfortable, they're muscle memory, they're things that we have mastered in terms of the process.
Right. Eliminate
those barriers and get the learner back onto the pathway that's going to lead them to life and career success.
I would echo all of what Jim just said, and I want to also just to shout out to one of my colleagues. My first piece of advice to everybody would be to come to North Carolina and talk to my colleague Eric Fotheringham, who works in our academic affairs division and has been just breaking his pick on this topic of re-engagement in adult learners for many years. And most of what I've learned from it about it, I've learned from Eric. And so I don't know if he's listening, but others who are, reach out to Eric certainly, and if you want his coordinates, please feel free to contact me. I would just say, you know, John, I'm a little bit of a broken record here in our system on this, but you know, to me, a lot of the conversation around adult learners has stopped too soon after the intuition that there's 1 million plus of them here, and we should just go out and recruit them and bring them back, and so let's pound the pavement and get some phone calls made and some re-recruitment, re-engagement efforts underway. And I think the risk there is to Burke's point, right? You bring people back to a model that wasn't set up particularly well for them to begin with. And so similar to how we're thinking creatively here in North Carolina and across the industry, I would argue, with the federal relief dollars to really sort of transform some of the way we're doing the enrollment funnel for re-engagement and returning students. I think we also need to use the opportunity to think creatively about the supply side again, right? So now's a time to think about how you deliver your education and how it's structured and how it can fit into people's lives who are busy. There's really no better time to do that than now, when we've got some funding from both federal sources and in our case from a generous state legislature to think creatively about that supply side. Because I think, you know, I for one think that we've done a lot more work on the demand side of this equation, and that includes kind of all parties, right? Higher ed, foundations, others, and we haven't paid nearly enough attention to the supply side. Meanwhile, you know, we know a lot about how to adjust some of the supply side question from other universities that have been successful in this space at not only recruiting but supporting students who've come back. Let me add a little bit, sort of take it into the weeds a little bit deliberately. You know, so there's kind of 3 elements to risk for a student, and you know, Jim hit on all of them, but one is price, which is a function of both the list price and how you pay. Subscription, all at once, how you pay. Think about a gym membership. You know, do you pay monthly or for the annual membership? College is an annual membership. We do monthly membership, or many others. Second is academic risk. If you're not successful, you know, do you have a black marker on your transcript? What does it take to rehabilitate that? And third is time. And but what makes it difficult for colleges to solve these is Title IV in many ways prohibits colleges from solving these. Is that Title IV organizes coursework with essentially a certain price point for the most part, or the system does. It has to start at a certain point and end at a certain point for the most part. You pay once. You have to move through satisfactory academic progress. And so we've done some things. We worked with the Obama administration with the EQUIP program and shoehorned our courses into a Title IV framework. And it was interesting, but it turned out that we would have to do weird things, like students would start a course, could move as fast as they want, couldn't start another one until the next semester started.
Right.
But that's the way satisfactory academic progress works. That's the way funds are distributed. That's the way Title IV is constructed. So to solve some of the supply side issues, schools they can either be very inventive themselves or try and reinvent the wheel, or they have to partner with other providers. Now, and what's happened in the last decade is there are ample people doing those sorts of things, but you can't solve the supply side issue without looking beyond Title IV.
Amanda, I'm going to ask the next question to you in a very real sense. Some of the solutions that Andrew's described, Jim has described, Burke has described can't happen. There can't be changes to the higher ed culture without changes to the policies. And how they're enacted. So let's talk for a moment in response to this question. How can states, systems, and institutions adopt policies and practices that work for all students while recognizing that each stop out situation is in fact unique?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for the states that are trying to take this on. And it also differs across states who have different governance structures. So some have
Right.
stronger, university systems or college systems that they're working with. Others are, a group of independent sort of public colleges. And so that heightens the challenge. So figuring out how to, and especially in this time when not only do we have stop-outs that we're trying to engage, but enrollment has dropped at many colleges, especially in the community college sector, seeing a drop in students for a lot of the same reasons you'll see for adult student stop-outs across all of higher education. So it's a challenge that has to be sort of approached in its own unique context. And different states are sort of trying to figure out, are there policies that we currently have in place that are not serving students? Main things that they're looking at, data systems. Are we collecting the right kind of data and sharing the right kind of data with our institutions so that they can have these kinds of discussions in their regions? Do our financing systems actually meet the needs of the students who need to come back? Is it do our state programs, financial aid programs, meet the needs of part-time students or adult students who need to come back or who maybe want to accelerate or want a short-term credential before they move on to a longer-term credential? Are we actually funding those type and prioritizing the needs of those types of students? So I think also some of the policies around access, as I mentioned, as the portal of access to things like TANF and SNAP ENT, and some of these programs that provide a portal to career pathways or that can support students as they return or go to an institution to receive education and training. How are state policies setting us up for failure or for access being a huge point of access for students? How are we providing professional development to agency leads or to advisors to be able to let them know what's out there in the state and what's being invested in? So I think sort of the some of the things that states are struggling with, and some are making great strides, but they're really thinking about what's the data, what barriers have we put up? When Jim mentioned, higher ed great at putting up the administrivia, which I immediately wrote that down as a word that I will integrate into my everyday life. State policy is the same way.
Right.
Really good at, the siloing effect of a lot of these policies,
Right.
and the barriers that we put up inadvertently to the people that we're trying to serve. So I think an examination of those types of state policies are critical. And I think what I have worked in a Sheeo office in the past, and I think what's really important and what can help move these things forward is if there's a clear line of communication between state policymakers and institutions as to these are the barriers we're coming up against. What are some solutions? How we can't be as innovative as we'd like to be because we keep bumping up against this. Can we have a solution to this? And I think that feedback loop is critical, and where it occurs, that's where you start to see movement when barriers can be removed at the state policy level to then be removed at the administrative level at institutions, all in service of students. So I think it's a big feedback loop, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for state policy to be refined in a way that allows institutions to do the type of work you're hearing about on this panel today, but then also to improve systems for the outreach and connection to community colleges and transfer conversations that have to happen to serve adult students, all the things that sort of live in the ecosystem of serving adults. There's opportunities for state policy to incentivize and support those things in ways that we haven't in the past. And hopefully conversations like these are going to help to highlight some of the places where states can hone in and sort of make those improvements to create larger impacts for student populations.
Burke, what Amanda is describing by way of barriers can tend to, for a long time now, to adversely impact the students who need to be adversely impacted the least. And so when we think in terms of adult populations and other targeted demographics that have been traditionally underserved, how can we ensure equitable access and opportunity for stop outs from all backgrounds and life situations?
Yeah, so if, one of the theses, certainly ours, and also I think agreed to on this call, is that a really important part of the returning student equation is the ROI to a degree. Improving that ROI is important. Now, most efforts are sort of focused on the R side, and that's great, but it's really hard to quantify, and there are increasing questions as to whether we've really moved the needle at all. And also with kind of growing list price, it's certainly much harder to make the R work. Now, the other way to change the ROI is to focus on the I side and make that less than what it was. And so whether that's all the things we mentioned before, but that's investment has multiple elements. It's the actual price, it's the way you pay, it's the sort of the outcomes you get on your transcript, it's the time you spent, the opportunity cost of what it would take. And so again, de-risking that entry pathway, and it's not just what we're doing in Louisiana, which is a great example, and we're doing it with some other schools, but there's plenty of other examples. The MicroMasters programs are similar. It's take a couple free courses, and if you're successful, awesome, off you go, and you get some credit, and you save some money, and you've proved your ability to do the work. And I think the co-requisite, sort of the move to co-requisite, we haven't, as higher ed, like figured out how to teach algebra better. So it is weird that people who otherwise would have been developmental students when get put into credit-bearing courses ultimately succeed at higher rates. There's something to that that's not about the academics, it's about the investment, is that people are not spending a year or 2 years in no credit coursework using $4. And so these are the sorts of things that can make a big difference, is kind of creating, again, low risk entry points to then lead to then higher risk, higher investment decisions. But this ultimately is an equity conversation, because the people who hurt the most with the high risk entry points are those who can least afford it. And we've seen that through all the numbers we get in higher ed.
Agreed. It's fantastic feedback all the way around the panel. There was a comment.
John, I just wanted to make
Andrew, go ahead. Yeah.
Two concrete sort of observations that related both to what Amanda was saying, what Burke was saying, that I would offer up from North Carolina. One is one that we've successfully changed, which was traditionally there was an excess credit surcharge in North Carolina. So if you took more than, if you had earned more than 140 credits, you were charged kind of 25% surcharge or 50% surcharge, depending on kind of what year it was, and they kind of ramped it up. We successfully argued that this was really not a good idea if what you were trying to do is promote degree completion, because you would convince people who were just at the finish line not to come back to finish those additional credits, because they would cost so much more. To Burke's point, right? If you want to talk about de-risking, that goes in the opposite direction, right? Which is charging people a whole bunch more for credit. So credit surcharges, again, understand the intent to kind of convince people that they should finish more quickly and not have excess credit. When it comes to sort of practice, it's a really difficult thing for a set of students. The only other thing I'd say is, and we've been less successful up to now on this, but we're still working at it, is, it seems simple, but it's often something we just discount, which is we're trying to move the university to more of a year-round calendar, right? Where summertime is summertime in particular, but also winter sessions are regular time to earn credit. They are not kind of the downtime or the sleepier time when there's fewer credit hours offered and fewer student services available and so forth. But that sounds simple, but it is really sort of, when you look at the institutions that serve a lot of adults, that's what they do. You can earn credit all year round, and the old kind of agrarian calendar that we have operated on for centuries is kind of thrown out the window. And so we've been trying to push and think about that. We have an enrollment funding model. So credit hours that are offered in the fall and spring traditionally have received state appropriation. Those that are offered in the summertime for in-person credits have not been. And so that creates this distortion, right? Even though credit hour is a credit hour is a credit hour, in our opinion. So those are just two concrete things that they're not necessarily geared toward adult students or partway
Right.
home, but they're fundamental to flexibility and better use of the calendar.
And great points, Andrew. We've seen more states looking at their policies across the landscape where the summer session needs to be treated on some equal footing when it comes to providing the aid that's typically associated with fall and spring semesters. That's a great point. Well, we are near our last question. I'll ask for a kernel of wisdom as we approach it from all of our panelists. Our Q&A box has been filling with questions as well as our chat room. And so we're monitoring both of those so that we have a little time for some Q&A before the end. But as we approach the questions that you, our audience, have submitted, I'll go around the panel and ask for a word of wisdom. If you could recommend one change to help an institutional or state leader better meet the needs of stop-outs, what would it be? And Jim, we'll start with you.
Well, one is, and there's been a couple of leadership questions that have come up. Quite often we have become adept at engaging people in crafting solutions, but the step we miss is engaging people in defining the problems, right? And so articulating the problems is when you can get to the granularity necessary to target solutions, and you're going to be so much more effective. You'll have to expend a lot less time, and your return on your expenditure of effort will be that much greater. So take the time to engage your stakeholders, your faculty, your support staff, your front-facing staff, and actually defining the problem. And don't take for granted that everyone is on the same page of what that problem truly is.
Great point. Amanda.
I didn't know you were going to jump over to me next. I think this can't just be an administrative exercise for states to think about. So I think we get caught up in sort of like, what can we do data-wise? What can we do policy-wise? I think we have to figure out how to get those solutions that are developed to the people who need them. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that states are thinking about too, is if we develop this, how do we then get to those folks and tell them what we have and what opportunities exist out there for them? And sort of thinking about that in a whole higher education, post-secondary ecosystem approach for a state. There was a question brought up about, I think in the chat, around community colleges, and really thinking about how do all of our systems and private institutions who want to jump on the, at the table too, how do we figure out how to best serve students and not be focused on maybe what institution is serving them within our systems, but how do we get them what they need, and how do we get that information to them in a way that they can use? So I think kind of that communication piece would be a piece that I would emphasize as a priority.
That's great. Great reference there. You're right to what was asked. Burke, will come around. If you could recommend a change to help leaders better meet the needs of stop-outs.
Sure. So I think I'd start with a few things. One, realizing that the post-secondary landscape, the post-secondary universe has gotten really big over the last decade, and that accredited colleges are a small, I wouldn't say small, they're actually a big part of it, but relative to the overall universe, they're getting smaller. And students have lots of choices, and they're using them. And this last recession was really counterintuitive in the data that it spit out. But there are some really critical roles, and sort of gets to one of the questions. I know we're running to the top, but we're running out of time. One of the questions that's been asked, there are still really critical roles that schools play, and maybe one of the most is trusted advisor. Is that these are pillars of the community. They have the ear of the K-12 system, the higher ed system, the state government. And what was amazing for us, one thing we saw when we were working with in an academy model, is we check net promoter scores, which is the measure of student satisfaction, and ours are good across regular StraighterLine. But when we put it into a private labeled program with a college, that net promoter score doubled. So same courses, same people, same everything, but under the college's brand as opposed to ours, students are twice as happy. So what does that mean? That means that students really trust their colleges to put them in the right place, to give them what they're supposed to be doing. And colleges have a role to be able to point students to things that make the most sense. But there's lots of other options out there. And if they don't bring that under their umbrella, if they don't count everything, then they're going to lose that trusted role. And students are going to start to go elsewhere.
Great point.
So part of it is realizing that it's a social function as opposed to just, how do I get people into my courses? And if you don't do that, then students are going to find other places to go.
Great point. And Andrew.
Boy, there were so many that were taken already. I would just say, similarly to some of the comments made about, there's some comments about sort of start with by defining the problem and so on and so forth. I just think generally too, what gets measured gets done. So if you want to have goals around this,
That's a great point.
And how many types of students in this category you'd want to bring in, and how many you want to re-engage, how many you want to graduate, and so forth, and just sort of pay attention to that. I think sometimes sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the outcome of all this work, and so I think I would just suggest to leaders that if you want to get serious about it, set some goals around it, and make sure you hold your folks accountable for reaching those goals.
Great, thank you. I see the time. I still want to attempt, if we can, maybe to get in a question or two. Some that have been submitted into the question and answer room have been answered already. So let's look at engaging the faculty. That's one question that's come in. So we'll ask of you, Jim and Andrew, moving from that administrative level that was discussed moments ago, how did you onboard, the personnel of the university who are in first engagement with students and faculty?
I think it's key that you're having ongoing conversations, right? You're not waiting till the moment of truth or the implementation of a solution to engage faculty in the process. They have to be a key part, both in the planning session, but then continually, day to day, in understanding what are the challenges that are preventing us from delivering the mission, right? What is the mission? Now, what are the steps in the mission, or what are the things that we hold sacred that are part of that administrative, but what are the things that are actually central to the mission? And that's when you can overcome a lot of objections to things. Our partnership with StraighterLine and the Academy is not a traditional approach to higher education. And if we start with saying, hey, here's a new initiative we're going to throw your way, you immediately get this hands up. What is the next thing that this guy in Baton Rouge who's not on our campus is going to make us do? Right. But we've been talking about the needs of learners and the reason why we as a state in Louisiana have got to prepare Louisianans for a world of work that's almost impossible to predict. And you've engaged them in that conversation, then they say, you know what, this makes sense to come up with a creative partnership that's going to speed the intake of Louisianans so that they can be prepared for life and career success. All of a sudden it becomes much more an organic process rather than someone trying to fit a round peg in a square hole.
Fantastic. Great advice all the way around. We're just beginning to have a great conversation. We'll pause here, but great questions. We want to thank all of you in attendance for what you've submitted to us. We're looking to provide some more information and hope that you'll reach out to us by any means, and we'll be pleased to share all the more that we can. Burke, I want to thank StraighterLine again for hosting us today and invite you to give us final comment and closing greetings.
Well, since we're at the top of the hour, I'll make my final comment short, but really thank you, John, for this great moderation of this session. I've been on a few of these. This was expertly done. It felt like 60 minutes, but less painful. So thank you. And thank you to Andrew and Jim and Amanda for joining us. I think this was a really interesting conversation from the system to the institutional to the non-institutional level. So, and to our faculty for joining us. I hope it was helpful, and there are lots of ways to get in touch with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and everyone have a great afternoon. Very best wishes to you and your communities.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you.